We are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Colonel Ann Wright, who is a retired U.S. Army colonel, former State Department official, actually helped open up the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan, and of course, for many of us, is a hero of ours for resigning in the run-up to the Iraq invasion. So, Ann, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Eugene and Rania. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, you've really much seen this from the beginning. I mean, you were there opening up the U.S. Diplomatic presence in Kabul in 2001. So, I mean, maybe just my first question for you is looking back a year later from U.S. withdrawal, what are your feelings about this entire process, which seems to have just been so destructive?
Well, when I was there 20 years ago in 2001, actually almost 22 years ago, we were predicting it would be the U.S. had better do whatever it was going to do and get out of there fast. As we all knew, the history of Afghanistan is that any foreign invader does not have a long shelf life. But we can say that the United States did extend its shelf life over and over and over again to the trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of Afghan lives that were lost, as well as U.S. and NATO lives. But we all knew that this would eventually end, and we were thinking it was going to end much sooner. And then once I resigned from the government a year and a half after I was in Afghanistan, I joined the peace movement, and we were pushing hard all the time from 2004, 5, 6, all to get U.S. troops out of there, because it was the U.S. troops' presence that was creating the huge numbers of casualties that were going on. To see what has happened and that the a horrible evacuation process. I mean, a really horrible. I was in charge of an evacuation in 2007, 1997, from Sierra Leone, where we evacuated 2,500 people in 3 days, and that was tough. To see what they decided in a short amount of time to try to evacuate the international community from Kabul, and over that 15-day period, 120,000 people evacuated, but leaving the place in chaos. And it's just a terrible situation that people of Afghanistan have found themselves in, with a government that the United States signed an agreement with withdrawal, and yet is unwilling to release the funds that are Afghan funds that can be used for the benefit of the Afghan people, many of whom are starving to death right now because of the economic situation that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really stunning. There was this group of economists that actually, several dozen, in fact, U.S. and international economists, who just this week, they released a letter urging the U.S. government to release the $7 billion in Afghanistan central bank assets that the Biden administration froze after essentially handing the country over to the Taliban. And now we've seen these stories of just desperation across Afghanistan. The few services that they did have been pretty much halted because of a lack of being able to import things like fuel and food, and people are selling their organs, in some cases their children, to be able to buy food and avoid starving. I mean, it's just absolutely atrocious. And of course, as soon as the U.S. withdrew, you saw every single media outlet rush to the country to advocate against the withdrawal. And now that the U.S. is continuing to attack the country with economic warfare, I mean, there are no cameras paying attention anymore whatsoever. So I'm just curious, in all this time that, since the war in Afghanistan began in the early 2000s till now, I mean, what's your assessment of the way the media has treated the situation? Because in many ways, it just seems like they've kind of been an arm of the State Department. It's whatever the U.S. wants, the media wants. And the only time I saw that change was when Biden withdrew, and we saw this sort of crazy attempt by the media in the U.S. to try to get everybody in the U.S. emotional so that they would oppose the withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're exactly right. The media, kind of goes with the wind. And to see right now that it is giving up really on the wind, so to speak, that they are refusing really to cover in great measure the horrific humanitarian crisis that's going on. The families selling their kids, as you mentioned, selling the organs, food not being available, and yet there are funds that are being held by the U.S. and by the EU and other organizations that should be released. I mean, it's not the fault of the people of Afghanistan of really what has happened, and some of them do support the Taliban, but most of them don't. And most of them just would like to have a little bit of peace and quiet in their country, which has been ravaged by war since the Soviet invasion back in the early 1980s. And then after they were kicked out, then the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, started fighting among themselves. The outgrowth of the Taliban after that, and then the U.S. coming in and being in there for, a decade and a half. So the people of Afghanistan would like to have some peace and quiet. And to mention that indeed now the statistics are that under the Taliban rule, there is much less danger and much less killing that's going on, although today, tragically, ISIS or one of the groups blew up a mosque and killed, I believe it's 41 people. But the actual combat out in the fields, which was going on while the U.S. was there, has stopped. But you've got all of these people that would like to have some work, would like to have an opportunity to, have their kids go to school, to include the girls going to school. The Taliban certainly has not helped itself by these policies that they have put back in place, which is, really keeping women out of daily life, putting them back in the burqa and refusing to educate them. And that has given the international community exactly the rationale they needed to say, we just won't give any money of your own money back to you until you change your ways in many ways. And it's a horrible predicament for those fine people of Afghanistan.
I think that's such a good point, Ann, because, to me, it speaks to this idea or this feeling that, was so prevalent. I mean, I remember when, I can remember it so well, we went in, they said, we're going to get, bin Laden. And then next thing we're going to change Afghanistan to a democracy and we're going to bake, Afghanistan like Delaware or something. And it's just like, it feels like we're using almost the same logic when it comes to the issue of frozen funds, which is that somehow the U.S. can use its coercive power to make people live the way they want to live or do the things they want them to do. And whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, it just seems like that underlying premise just doesn't work, that you can't just go and put a gun to people's head and say, do this or else, because that's exactly what breeds the kind of resentment that ends up in the type of blowback that put us in Afghanistan in the first place. Yeah,
you're exactly right. The bullying tactics that the United States continues to use, you'd think that we would kind of figure out that these things don't work. I mean, they just haven't worked anywhere, and yet that's the go-to policy of all of these administrations, is just bully the hell out of everyone to try to get them to do what you want, and they won't do it. And who gets hurt? Well, it's the poor people in the country that the United States has invaded, has occupied, now have economic warfare on them. You would think that someday we would learn the lessons of history, but I'm afraid American politicians are definitely not historians, and they don't want to become one.
That's right.
Speaking of, excuse me, this whole idea of like the failed nation building project in Afghanistan, and when you really think about it, all the times the U.S. has claimed to be nation building in its wars, it's always ended in a very dramatic kind of collapse. And I think at least, being in the Middle East, you do see that after the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, it really raised the eyebrows of those who consider themselves to be clients of the Americans, because it demonstrated that the Americans do not, stand by their allies. I know that sounds very cliche, because we heard that a lot in the media is, oh my God, the U.S. doesn't stand by its allies. This makes us look so bad. But actually, it's true. In a sense, because the U.S. left, and what happened to the Afghan army that they spent 20 years supposedly building and funding and arming, and Ashraf Ghani's entire government, they had to flee, and it collapsed like really easily and quickly. They didn't even put up a fight. And I think a lot of, when we kind of look at the big picture globally, as we enter this new era of like new Cold Wars, it I think does play into, I would imagine, if I'm Taiwan, or even if I'm Ukraine, maybe, or if I'm Saudi Arabia, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, oh, so like if there's a war here, maybe the U.S. isn't going to come and help me and save me. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that and that dynamic at play. And in a sense, it kind of shows the fact that the U.S. for 20 years couldn't beat the Taliban, right? U.S. has way more resources, best armed military in the whole world, couldn't defeat them after 20 years, left in a kind of humiliated way. If it kind of speaks to a new American weakness.
Well, I would say that the weakness is, that we continue to think that our bullying tactics of our military, the warmongering that we do, is actually going to accomplish whatever it is that we think we want to accomplish. And I think that's one of the questions. What do we want to accomplish? I mean, if you look at the original idea of going into Afghanistan, it was to go after Al-Qaeda, but that quickly morphed, as Eugene said, morphed into, now let's go after the Taliban, now let's complete rebuilding or a building of a supposedly democratic society. Things that we have tried in other places, and sometimes they've been a little bit more effective, but usually when there's no war attached to it. The whole issue of Taiwan, the issue of Ukraine, let's just throw in Iran and North Korea. Now, how many Iranians actually trust the United States after the Trump administration threw out the JCPOA on the nuclear deal? And why should Kim Jong-un in North Korea trust one thing the United States says when he looks at the history of what we've done in Libya, what we've done in Iran, what we've done in Afghanistan? So, it's not that we as a nation, our politicians of both parties are trustworthy on the international scene. And I think the rest of the world knows that. It's just we in the United States, the U.S. public still is being blinded by what they think the United States really our history is, when in fact we've really been less than honest with ourselves about really what our history is. And good old Howard Zinn and some of the great historians that have told us flatly what our history is, and then their books get thrown off the shelves because it doesn't fit the narrative of our current politicians.
Yeah, no, such an important point. I actually saw someplace the other day down south remove the Diary of Anne Frank from their school library, and I just thought, you've got to be kidding me, what's going on here? But no, I think that's such a good point, and I mean, we talked about it earlier with the media, and it also seems like it's also just like the way mass entertainment portrays so many of these conflicts. I mean, the handful of movies about Afghanistan, the one that really stands out to me is Black Hawk Down, about Somalia, that doesn't even tell the whole story that was told in the book, much less the whole story of what went on. I mean, it just seems like we also have such this veneration of war culturally that, really sort of feeds into people's preconceived notions around a lot of this propaganda, because it's like, oh, I've seen the Top Guns and the Black Hawk Downs and this, that, and the third. And so people are always sort of giving the benefit of the doubt to the warmongers when they make this. And it seems like societally, that's something that we really have to look at, is why do we venerate the war makers as opposed to the peacemakers?
Yeah, that's right. And the peacemakers get thrown in jail. I mean, here we've got Daniel Hale, the great whistleblower on drones, on assassin drones. We've got Ed Snowden, who's in exile in Russia. We've got Julian Assange, who is still languishing in a London prison and perhaps being extradited to the United States. You look at the whole series of people who are currently in jail, and then you think of all these others that have been put in jail because all they've done is tell the truth about what America is doing to the world. It's a horrific, horrific situation, and all of these administrations just keep going after the truth tellers instead of the warmongers and criminals.
I also, Anne, wanted to get your take on the fact that this kind of happened without any major attention, but the fact that the U.S. Recently assassinated the leader of Al Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, I believe, he was in Kabul, right? I'm pretty sure it was, or just outside of Kabul. It was probably, the U.S. probably knew where he was for some time. But it was just interesting the way that happened because of the fact that, first of all, at this point, it's just an elderly man. I'm not sure how much sway Al Qaeda really has anymore, because ISIS is like the new kid on the block that all the extremists want to join these days. But it is interesting that after all this time of war on terror, these groups not only still exist, the fact that there's more of them now than there was before. I believe in Syria, specifically in Idlib, Al Qaeda has, or at least the former Al Qaeda franchise there, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it's considered to be like one of Al Qaeda's greatest strongholds it's ever had in its existence. You have the proliferation of ISIS across parts of Africa, supposedly. And also along with that, you have the proliferation in parallel to that of all these weapons that have, are really from the wars that the U.S. launched in Libya and Syria. So I'm just curious, what do you have to say about the fact that over 20 years ago at this point, we launched this so-called war on terror that's still taking place today, still being used to justify American presence, military presence across the world, with no end in sight. No one really talks about it anymore. And at the same time, the supposed threat is actually bigger today than it was in 2001.
Yeah. Well, the moral of the story to me is that you don't need to use the military to go after persons who may have committed international crimes. The police, an international police operation to go after Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and then Pakistan would have been much more effective than the U.S. sending its military into Afghanistan and raising Cain in there for 20 years. So, trying to get, but that doesn't sell weapons. I mean, that's the other part we have to bring up, that the weapons manufacturers have a great deal to say about warmongering in our country and putting pressure on politicians to use war instead of diplomacy, because that will sell weapons. And Ukraine is certainly the example where in a short period of time, in less than 6 months, the United States has dumped more weaponry into one little country than I think we have ever done in the whole history of the world, of the U.S. history, 240 years of it. Even during Vietnam, I don't think we had as much weaponry that went into that country in such a short amount of time. So warmongering, weapons industries, replenishing weapons is the name of the game for the industries as well as the politicians who make money, campaign contributions from these big companies that are making a killing out of the killing.
No doubt about that. And obviously a lot for us to continue to push on. But as always, Colonel Ann Wright, we are really honored to have you here with us and you giving us some of your very precious time on the freedom side.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Keep it up. Thank you.
Thank
Peace
you.
for everybody, please.